is now my third contribution virtually to a COP26 event, and the second that our partnership is presenting that partnership on the work that we are doing, called Inclusive Budgeting and Financing for Climate Change in Africa, is a partnership between CABRI, IIED, UNDP, and the International Budget Partnership as well, with the support of the Swedish government. Today we will also hear from GFLAC, who work with civil society organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I suppose importantly, we should say that governments and civil society organizations from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and those around the world have been working in support of a more inclusive approach to climate budgeting. The discussion today will also consider how gender-responsive climate budgeting can be strengthened for improved economic and social outcomes. And I suppose underpinning that would be our view that integrating gender into climate responsive budgeting is increasingly recognized for its ability to ensure the more effective, efficient, and equitable use of public financial resources. From the work that we have been doing, our experience with gender responsive climate budgeting is that gender and climate change are two cross-sectoral priorities which are central to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that is an obvious point to start off with. And then most countries have some experience with gender responsive budgeting, and then almost separately climate responsive budgeting, and seldom do we find that the two have been integrated in the way that we have been approaching the work on gender responsive climate budgeting. There is increasing recognition of the linkages between gender equality and climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. One, women are disproportionately affected by climate change, which I suppose we can also say is increasing existing gender inequality, given their social and political status in society. And also that women are active change agents and central to building community resilience. Recent calls for the joint integration or double mainstreaming of gender and climate change into budgeting and finance is gaining support across the African continent, in particular as ministries of finance and where they exist, ministries of gender are coming together into policy dialogues. Our lessons from past experience with cross-cutting theme mainstreaming highlights a couple of key enabling conditions. And I'm just going to list these enabling conditions. Firstly, that it does require consistent leadership and sustained commitment. That it does not necessarily have to be located within a single ministry or even within government, but more of a cross-section of government and civil society, and also within government across ministries of finance, gender ministries, and also environment ministries. Another enabling condition is policy or strategic frameworks that need to be in place. Policy and political dialogues are important and needs to be ongoing. There should be clear implementation guidelines and tools. Also important to have incentives in place, but alongside those to ensure that there is also accountability. The necessary financial and human resources to ensure that there is the necessary capability. And part of the implementation stage of our program is to build up a cadre of a cross-section of people coming from both civil society and from government that will be thinking more deeply about this issue of double mainstreaming and how that is applied within their civil society organization or within their government ministries. And then lastly, we also want to, and believe that a learning culture is important and want to certainly foster that learning culture where we are asking the questions in terms of the progress that is being made and how we learn from that in the next steps that we undertake. Let me make some concluding remarks so that we can get into, I suppose, the meat of our session today. Firstly, coordinating the integration of gender and climate change may strengthen public expenditure, and I hope that we are able to unpack this point a bit more today. Second, that while there are some developing countries that have begun to implement gender responsive climate budgeting, and the idea is to hear from those countries that are here with us today, Rwanda and Bangladesh, and also from the work that GFLAC has been doing. And then lastly, that successful reforms will need to engage multiple stakeholders, including civil society organizations, as I've emphasized. Development partners should also be our allies in this work that we're going to be undertaking. So thank you very much, and I hope that I've not gone on for too long, and that I've provided some food for thought for the discussions going forward. And I think I now can hand over to Shanaz.
Great, thank you so much, Neil, for getting us started. So good morning, everyone. My name is Shanaz Borman and I work for the Cabinet Secretariat. We are happy to be with you this morning as part of the Climate and Development Days. So this morning I will be moderating a session on advancing gender equality, advancing gender responsive climate budgeting and financing. So the session brings together different perspectives from the Global South on how gender responsive budgeting can be implemented for sustainable and inclusive development. So on the panel today, we have 3 distinguished speakers from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, who will share with us how governments in the developing world are taking a more inclusive approach to climate budgeting. We will then open for questions from the floor. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat or raise your hand. You can also just introduce yourself in the chat. So I'm so pleased to introduce our first speaker. He's Mr. Fred Sabiti, who is the National Technical Advisor on the Environment and Climate Change Mainstreaming at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning in Rwanda. Mr. Sabiti, if you could please share with us Rwanda's experience integrating gender and climate change into national budgeting and financing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know if you are hearing me.
We hear you clearly.
And you can be able even to see the screen.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you very much. I will go quickly to what Rwanda is doing in terms of taking into consideration the gender, climate change, and environment-related interventions, and how we are trying to look at them in terms of finance, in terms of budgeting. So we will specifically be looking at the Rwanda's gender approach to development, the concept of environment, climate change, and the gender, the challenges that we currently face, entry points at policy level, and then we will also look at the entry points at the budget and financing, and then finally with some key recommendations that we need to share with our specific fellow countries. So to begin with, Rwanda has actually taken some good step in terms of gender approach to development and how we view gender. These are some of the areas that we have been able to look at from a policy perspective. We have a ministry in charge of gender and family promotion that is responsible to look at the gender interventions across different institutions. All the institutions per the law have developed the gender mainstreaming strategy to support the gender mainstreaming. We have also a department under the national police that is following up closely on the gender-based violence. Apparently, we have a law that puts 30% of women to be elected in decision-making organs. We have gender and family promotion as cross-cutting area under National Strategy for Transformation, which is our medium-term strategy. We have it under the sector strategic plans, and we also have it under the district development strategies. Apparently, we have about 61% of women representatives in parliament. So if we are looking at the concept of poverty, gender, environment, and climate change, we are actually looking at it from the aspects of the climate change that normally affect gender, mostly women. We are also looking at it from the effects that men and women actually get as a result of the climate change impacts. So in Rwanda, we are saying that if we are in agriculture, we are talking of over 90% of our small farmers being women, and therefore it is very important that we take them into consideration when we are looking at the aspects to do with climate change aspects. So those impacts of the climate change, if you are looking at the flooding, if you are looking at different areas, if you are looking at the business aspect, so the environmental degradation and climate change impacts are not gender neutral. So that means they are affecting both women, men, girls, and boys to a large extent. So some of the challenges that we have been able to come up with in the last year assessment that we conducted, specifically on environment, climate change, and gender related, we found out actually that there is a gender gap in agriculture productivity caused by climate variability. We also found out that there are issues under the raw adoption of the sustainable practices, where we found out actually that some of the female managed farms compared to men managed farms have different problems in terms of the climate change. In terms of the energy, we found out actually that women are the ones that are getting much affected because they are the ones mostly engaged in cooking, and over 79.9% of our people still use biomass. So you see, it is again a big problem that is not gender neutral, that affects one side more than the other. Under the industries, we found out that actually there are a lot of gender disparities in the industries, especially under the green employment, limited female participation in the mining industry. We have a lot of mining activities going around, but over 90% of these workers under mining are actually men, and women are very few. So in urbanization, it is also an issue in terms of affordability of the housing, planned settlements, women-headed households and poor families actually numbering very low compared to men. That is the same thing that happens in other sectors across. I had also put some few elements that we need. We had started to work on actually on agriculture, looking at how we can be able to train farmers on bio-based products for pest management, aspects to do with the building capacities. Energy, we are looking at how we can use the improved cooking stoves that will support mostly women who are currently doing the cooking activities. The issues to do with sensitization. The same thing that we are proposing in industries, especially in the startups, and see how we can be able to incentivize the industries that are being started by women. Under urbanization, we are looking at how we can be able to put the strategic and practical needs for both women and men in terms of the design and planning for the green cities, and so on and so forth. These are some of the interventions that I've been talking about in terms of our culture. How can we be able to support both men and women in terms of landscape management? How can we be able to support them in terms of setting up some of the activities, the ecological activities, or some other putting up the settlements? How can we have these kind of investments involving men and women? So the process actually started with a number of interventions. For example, under the national policy and strategies, we started by developing the mainstreaming strategy that brings to surface some of the key performance indicators, including the indicators on environment and indicators on gender. We had also developed as a country the Green Growth and Climate Resilience Strategy that includes the 14 programs of action, and most of these are also gender and environment and climate change related. From there, since 2017 to 18, we developed the district development strategies that includes key interventions which are also gender and climate related, and also the sector strategic plans at the sector level that are also that includes a chapter on cross-cutting areas, specifically on climate change and gender, and that leads us again to the medium-term strategy, the national strategy for transformation, that includes a priority on number 7, which specifically talks about how the country is going to implement the climate change interventions with regard to gender aspects. So in terms of the budgeting and financing, under the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning, we have developed 2 tools which we use actually in each and every planning session, each and every fiscal year. We have what we call the checklist. It is a tool that we use, and it is an annex to the planning and budget core circular. It includes a list of indicators for each and every sector. So those indicators specifically for every sector, including the Ministry of Agriculture, including the Ministry of Infrastructure, including the Ministry of Trade and Industry, including the Ministry of Local Government, which also leads to the districts. So the indicators are selected and agreed upon by these institutions, and these indicators that are selected are climate resilient and are also gender sensitive. So they are sent to institutions to make sure that they take them into consideration during planning and budgeting period for each and every fiscal year. And again, under the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning, we have been able to develop what we call the Environment and Climate Change Monitoring Statement, which each and every institution has to feed while applying for the budget from the Ministry of Finance. This works hand in hand with the gender budget statement that is supposed to look at the budget allocations on gender-related interventions. So we have been able to develop these tools to make sure that the environment and climate change and gender mainstreaming are taken into considerations right from the policy perspective, strategic level, but as well as within the single action plans that institutions submit while requesting budgets in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. So we have started to use this since 2013, and the ongoing, we make changes every fiscal year. with sectors, depending on the key performance indicators that we want to tackle on, and depending on the availability of resources that we want to track and get from the treasury, or even from the other external support. This graph indicates the progress that we have been able to make in terms of the integrating the environment and climate change and gender indicators from 2014 and 2015. You can see some progress for 2019 and 2020. The integration in the single action plans was at the rate of 61.6. And when you look at the budget, it has also been increasing right from 2009. If we look specifically at 2019 and 2020, we are at around 4.6%. So it's not that much, but at least there are some progress being made. And now the aim is to move, increasing the budget that is allocated to environment and climate change, which is at the same time going to support us to combat the effects of climate change that, as we have seen in the previous slides, affected both men and women. So the last slide talks about what we actually need to do going forward, maybe some best practices that even other countries can look at. Issues to do with prioritization. How are the sectors taking into consideration the aspects of environment and climate change and the gender budgeting? Looking at how we can be able to plan and budget, and also make sure that each and every new policy and strategy that comes to surface has to include the gender perspective. Apply new environment and climate change approaches that go beyond the conventional environment protection and adaptation actions for the implementation of green growth and climate resilience, but we also have to look at the gender perspective and how that will actually impact on gender. We're also looking at how we can be able to enhance the collection of sex disaggregated data. We know everywhere the issue of sex disaggregated data is a problem, and while you are combining it with environment and climate change related data, then it becomes a complex issue. So there is a need to look at how we can be wholesomely collect this kind of information, increase financing for affirmative actions and women's empowerment for addressing gender, environment, and climate change issues. And then we look at the issues to do with capacity building. This is an area where most developing countries are actually lacking. So people are still differentiating the gender aspects from the climate change aspects. So making the link between the two really needs capacity building, and how institutions can train their staff to be able to move so well. For large development projects, for the case of Rwanda, we said that this needs actually to have the environment and social impact assessment, and more focus should actually be given to gender impact and use gender smart procurement. So these are a number of elements that we are recommending that we have already started to work on as a country, and we think that maybe it can be useful to other countries. Thank you very much. I don't know if I have exceeded the time that I have been given. That is what I wanted to say on behalf of Rwanda. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sabiti. From your presentation, I think it's clear that Rwanda has been a true leader in promoting gender equality and climate change adaptation and mitigation, prioritizing key sectors such as agriculture, energy, industry, and urbanization. And I also appreciate that your presentation covered some of the challenges faced in promoting gender responsive climate budgeting. So if anyone has any questions for Mr. Sabiti, please feel free to write them down in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. I will now turn to our second speaker. I have the great pleasure to introduce Mr. Iqbal Hussein from the Ministry of Women and Children's Affairs in Bangladesh. Mr. Hussein, you have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon from Bangladesh. This is Muhammad Iqbal Hussein. I am Joint Secretary to the Government of Bangladesh, now posted in the Ministry of Women and Children Affairs, and working as a National Project Director of a project Gender Responsive Coastal Adaptation. The full name of the project is Enhancing Adaptive Capacity of Coastal Communities especially women, to cope with climate change-induced salinity. Actually, it is collaborative projects of the government of Bangladesh and the UNDP Bangladesh office, financed by Green Climate Fund and co-financed by government of Bangladesh. Now I am going to present Bangladesh experience on inclusive and gender responsive financing for climate budgeting, for climate change budgeting. Let me share my screen to you all. Okay. Okay. Thank you for inviting Khadbi to this session on gender responsive climate financing session. In Bangladesh, we have policy support in this regard. We have our national adaptation plan. We adopted it 2005. Bangladesh climate change strategy and action plans, a national plan for disaster management and national development policy, climate change gender action plan 2013, and Bangladesh climate fiscal framework. We have a vision 2041 and a perspective plan from 2021 to 2024 to make Bangladesh a developed country by 2021. We practice 8 5-year plans, and we are now running 8 5-year plan. Now we have developed a Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan recently in the name of our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. We have started our gender budgeting from fiscal year 2009 and 10. And we prepared our National Women Development Policy in 2011 to reduce the gender-based disparity and discrimination. And it's set to extend all kinds of support and assistance to the in eliminating bottlenecks and created due to climate change and disasters in respect of gender parity. We have also developed our climate change and gender action plan. And the climate change and gender action plan, the underlying principle of the plan is transformative nature of gender intervention. And the plan is prepared to empower and respond to the needs of the women in the concept and the context of climate change. And when it comes for decision making and implementation towards building a resilient communities, the plan says full and meaningful participation of the women. We have also created our own national climate funds. That is, we call it Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund. And it is mandated by a legal framework, Climate Change Trust Act, is passed by the Bangladesh Parliament in 2010. And this fund, Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund, is entirely from the government's own revenue budget, and about $1 million per year is contributed in this fund. We practice 8 5-year plans, and now we are running with 8 5-year plans from 2021 to 2025. The 6 core themes which the 5-year plan have, and 2 themes. And in the 8 5-year plan, Bangladesh government has committed to strengthen the Climate Change Trust Fund, and more than 80 billion taka to be mobilized for the adaptation and mitigation program under the current 5-year plan up to 2025. Bangladesh also submitted its nationally determined contribution to UNFCCC 1205, and we have an ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction target of 15%. And out of 5% reduction is unconditional and 10% is conditional. That is, we need from technical and financial support from the global community. These are policy supports. Now we come the scenario of gender budget and climate budget of Bangladesh. I have already mentioned that we have started climate budget, gender budget from fiscal year 2009 and 10, which was 25% of our total budget, and it is now around 30% of the total budget, which is allocated for the development of the women and women folks of the country. And regarding climate budget over time in Bangladesh, we have started climate budgeting from 2017 and 18, and it is increasing over time. Around 7 to 8% of our budget is for climate actions. And in the ministry which I am working, Ministry of Women and Children Affairs, the trend of climate budget is also increasing. It is about 13% of our total budget of the ministry. Then come to the climate budget tagging. We have a methodology in our Ministry of Finance Division. The methodology is applied in our automated integrated budget accounting system. We call it IBAS++. And to understand how much money is allocated towards gender-related activities while tracking climate budget. And for instance, fiscal year 2019 and 20, gender-relevant allocations was 26% in the climate budget allocation. And the prominent 25 ministries had 7.5% budget of the total budget for climate change, for gender activities, and 2% for climate activities, and 2% was for activities that address gender-related activities. And similar to the national budget, we are trying to tag the gender budgeting at our local government budgeting system. Because our local government budgeting system, we think that we see that 80% of our local budget is around social protection. So we go for adaptive social protection, which we think that it is the key entry point for local level gender tagging of climate budget. And we have a study, which started in 2016 and published in 2020. And under this study, we have designed our project, National Resilience Project, and we have tested it. Now we have designed our, this year, Gender Responsive Coastal Adaptation to scale up it. And we are just making it gender transformative adaptation to the climate vulnerable women. And the next, we have a plan to have a side event regarding GCA in the next COP. We invite you all the next COP in our side event. If we see the poverty and climate change vulnerability narratives in Bangladesh, our Bureau of Statistics report says poor people is 20%, and extreme poor is near about 13%, and climate vulnerable person 28%. And the poor marginalized group, they are the prime beneficiary of the social protection, and they are affected the climate change. So we are going for adaptive social protection, which reduce risk and targeting poverty and vulnerability. And we are adopting the right-based approach for promoting and transformation. That is promoting and promoting livelihoods, build a long-term resilience to climate change and disaster. And the key points is government of Bangladesh. Intention is 2%, more than 2% of GDP for spending for social protection, and it requires 0.7% of GDP equivalent if we put aside the government pension, public service pension. This requires new programs and additional programs, or additional to the existing programs. And adaptive social protection can be the can bridge the gap. And we need integrated social safety net programs targeting climate change vulnerable and disaster victims. And we also see that exposure and sensibility of climate hazards are different from men to women, poor and cis. And so approaches to reduce poverty and vulnerability has to be highly gender responsive. This is our learnings from our learnings. Thank you for patient sharing. Thank you all. This is all from the experience of Bangladesh.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hussein, for sharing that. I mean, it's so encouraging to hear about all the excellent work that Bangladesh has done, and we can clearly learn a lot. I mean, I sincerely wish that we had more time, because you've touched on so many important topics, which I think we can learn from. I mean, it's especially in relation to integrating gender into climate budget tagging, but also, you know, the national climate funds, but also the 5-year plans, and also, and I think very importantly, is, you know, the social protection system that you described. So thank you so much for sharing those important insights with us. I now have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Mrs. Sandra Guzman, who joins us from the Climate Policy Initiative, where she is the Climate Finance Manager. However, she also joins us in her capacity as founder of the Climate Finance Group of Latin America and the Caribbean, also known as GFLAC. She is also the former Director General of Climate Change Policies at the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources in Mexico. Sandra, thanks so much for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. First of all, my sincere apologies, because after 1 week at COP, I'm about to lose my voice, but I hope I can transmit all this information to you all. Thank you so much for the invitation to share an experience that...
Sorry, Sandra, the sound is not so great. I'm not sure if we can...
I'm going to take my video off, and I will see that it looks like this sound. Is that better?
Not much.
Okay, so what I will do is I'm going to join myself, and I'm going to run the presentation.
Sandra, this is Priya from Cabri. Your sound is not coming across very well. Can we try again, please?
Hi, it's Paul from my ID. I think she's trying to switch to her phone. Maybe she'll pick up a better signal. I think at COP, so many people are trying to access the internet. It's very congested.
Yes, we should mention that Sandra is kindly joining us from Glasgow, so we appreciate her making the time.
Thank you. Can you hear me there?
Yes, very clear now. Thank you so much.
Okay, what I will do is I'm going to use my audio for my cell phone, and I'm going to leave the presentation in my laptop. I'm sorry that I'm in the hotel, so the connection is not very good. Well, anyway, thank you so much for the invitation. I will have the pleasure to share with you an analysis that we conducted to understand like the extent to which Mexico has been mainstreaming gender and climate change in the public budget and accountability. And I mean, first of all, it's great to hear about the examples in Rwanda and Bangladesh, and you will see that in Mexico, although there was a little bit of progress in these regards, we have been observing different changes. So let me give you a little bit of context about where is Mexico standing at the moment. It is very important to give you this context because you will have a better understanding about what is happening in the country. So we had a change in the government in 2018. This new government from the left-wing party has been changing quite a lot the goals in terms of the vision of the country. Of course, some of the key issues that the country is aiming to work on is, like they reduce the corruption, like promote a welfare across the population. However, one of the key elements that this country has been promoting is to regain control of the of strategic natural resources. It's a country that has been, it's a government that has been promoting a lot the empowerment of the fossil fuel industry. And in this sense, this government established an important policy that is the austerity policy, which means that this government is aiming to use as little budget as possible for the operation of the whole public administrative system. I'm mentioning this because this austerity policy has been creating some important reduction in the public budget of the country. And that has been affecting, generally speaking, some agendas such as the climate change agenda, and you will see just now what I'm talking about. But it is important to say that this government had a national development plan, which is the main planning policy, which includes the sustainable development goals as key core of the national policy. However, of course, the role of the agendas have been changing. The gender agenda has been gaining, let's say, attention in the country, while the climate change hasn't been that progressive in this particular government. And I'm saying that this particular government, because in the past, both agendas in previous governments, both climate change and gender, were agendas that were not necessarily a priority in the country, but they were part of the planning process. And now we are seeing some changes in the government. So what I will do is I will take you a bit across the analysis that we did to show you to what extent this government has been spending public money related to gender and climate change. But we also analyzed not only the public expenditure, but also the planning, the sectorial programs to understand better to what extent sectors like the agriculture and welfare sectors have been integrating this analysis about the importance of gender and climate change separately, but as well as combined, like this mixed approach, to what extent these sectors are evolving or are understanding the relevance of gender and climate change in these sectors. This analysis that we conducted is all about understanding how these sectors are integrating and reflecting allocating enough resources to these agendas. This image is just to show you, for instance, how much it is important to tell you, one of the elements that was possible to do in 2012 was the creation of annexes in the public federal budget. This means that these annexes reflect how much each of the sectors in the country spend. There is an annex related to gender, and there is an annex related to climate change. So it is an exercise to show how much each of the sectors spend in these agendas. And this has been a very, very interesting exercise in terms of transparency, like to say, okay, every single ministry has to report how much do they spend in gender and how much do they spend in climate change, to see how these cross-cutting agendas have been integrated in the sectors. So what you can see in this image is the evolution of the changes across the last 5 years in terms of allocation of money to gender and climate change. So you will see, for instance, the gender annex reflects quite a lot of changes locally towards an increase, which is good in terms of the, generally speaking, for the gender agenda. However, in the case of climate change, you will see, which is the orange bar, you will see a change in the allocation of budget. Normally is always tending to it's decreasing, increasing, but it's never a very stable, let's say, allocation of resources. But let me give you a couple of examples about how this looks at the sectorial level. For instance, we analyze the agriculture sector, and the agriculture sector is quite clear in the goals that they want to pursue. And of course, one of the key elements is being self-sufficient, but as well as to include populations that are historically excluded. And at the same time, the idea of this government is to increase sustainable production practices in the agriculture sector, among other goals. So what you see in this image, for instance, it's how much the sector has been spending related to gender. And you will see, for instance, that in the allocation of gender budget in this agriculture sector, you can see an increase from 2019 and 2020. However, if you see the case of climate change, you will see an interesting decrease, a decreasing scenario, because in 2009, 50% of the budget was related was reported to this climate change budget, but then in 2020 there was a decrease. It is interesting to say that this obviously has different answers. So why is this happening? But one of the key elements is that this austerity policy that I was commenting has been affecting the way that the sectors are allocating money. And the climate change is one of the agendas that has been suffered the most, these cuts in the budget. This is the scenario about how the combined allocation between gender and climate change looks like. So for instance, 20% of the total budget of the sector in 2019 was, let's say, represent this combined agenda. But this changed a lot, in 2020. Only 8.4% was representing this combined agenda. So you will see this transformation in the allocation of resources. But what happened in the welfare sector? So the welfare sector, it's one of the elements is that is aiming to obviously provide or to guarantee the basic human rights, is trying to promote the participation of those populations that haven't been able to, access to different services, and is trying to look for that, to close that inequality gap. So in the welfare sector, the aim is to reduce, like the violence and all these, affectations towards like the most vulnerable people. But how the allocation on climate change looks like in the case of the welfare sector. So what you can see here is that, for instance, the gender budget actually increased in the welfare sector in between 2019 and 2020, which means that it's an important let's say conversation related to it is important to highlight that gender has been mainstream, or a little bit is increasing, let's say, the integration process in the welfare sector. And it's really interesting to tell you that in the case of the welfare sector, the budget related to climate change has been also increasing. There is a controversy, I have to say, related to what this climate change budget includes in the welfare sector. And this is all about the methodologies. Our colleagues were sharing these taxonomies and all these methodologies. And in the case of Mexico, the methodology that exists to allocate money in this budget, in this gender and climate change annexes, it's probably it's a methodology that has to improve, because like every single sector determines what they believe is climate change or what they believe is gender, and not always based on like a lot of knowledge. Like it's a lot of so sometimes it's a very subjective allocation of the resources. And of course, it is important that these annexes exist, but sometimes it's very important that we are able to polish these methodologies to reflect what is really, supporting the actions related to gender and climate change. So if we analyze finally kind of like the general, let's say the approach in the changes related to the budget, what you can see in this graph is in the first bar, you will see the allocation of money related to climate change versus like the gender annex. You will see a major difference. So I think in Mexico, we are still in process to understand better the importance of climate change and gender, both separately, but and I think there is a major gap in understanding the combination of these two. And I think this is precisely one of the areas that we believe it is important to keep promoting, how these two agendas interact and the importance of planning based in these two agendas. So we have been analyzing some recommendations, like to not only work in both agendas separately, but try to really combine these approaches. But to do that, it is very important to continue strengthening the legal framework, strengthening the mandates to ensure that these cross-cutting agendas are mainstreamed in the different sectors. And it is important to start like promoting, polishing these methodologies that we were discussing. It is important that the countries are improving the transparency processes, but it's really, really important that we polish the methodologies to have better understanding and clear understanding. And of course, it's a matter of keep building capacities to strengthen these mainstreaming processes. And to continue with this stakeholder participation. For instance, the creation of these annexes in the public budget was actually part of the work that the civil society has been doing in Mexico to promote better transparency tools. So it's important to say that these transparency mechanisms are response of those, advocacy work with from civil society and other entities. And finally, in the case of Mexico, in the context of the austerity policy, it is clear that there is a reduction in terms of the public budget. But unfortunately, it's not only about the reduction of public expenditure in the climate change and gender agenda. Well, the gender agenda has been less affected and has been actually improving in these regards. But it's also the fact that Mexico is allocating a lot of money to entities or to agendas that are actually increasing the problem, such as a lot of money is directed to the hydrocarbon production, for instance. So it's all about how it's not only a matter of not cutting resources, but try to allocate better resources with a perspective that is more integral, like these gender and climate change approaches that are very, very important for the development of the country. So this is just an example of Mexico, and I will be very, very happy to continue the conversation. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sandra Guzman, for sharing those very important insights from Mexico. Thank you in particular for sharing on the annexes in the annual federal budget, which actually allows one to track how much is allocated to each sector in terms of gender and climate change. And I mean, looking at all those impressive graphs that you've showed, I mean, it just brought home the idea of the need or importance of good data to track the allocation made to gender and climate change. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. We will now open for questions from the floor. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat or raise your hand. If you raise your hand, then I'll just call to see if you want to ask your question. Are there any questions? Paul Steele, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? Okay, it's in the chat. Paul's question is, why is spending on fossil fuels bad for women and girls? And second, what is the role for civil society? These are two really good questions, and I'll allow each of our panelists to answer this. Should we start with Fred? Mr. Sabiti from Rwanda?
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you repeat the first question?
So why is spending on fossil fuels bad for women and girls? And what is the role for civil society?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me also take this time to thank Paulo Stier, whom we happened to work together from Rwanda here. Hope he's doing fine. So thank you very much. I think if I begin with the civil society organization, for the case of Rwanda, we have tried to include every partner, every stakeholder in terms of environment and climate change, in terms of bringing on board of gender inclusiveness, including women, men, girls, and boys. If you look at how we do it, actually, is that all the planning processes, the civil society and the private sector are supposed to be part. I'm including the private sector, though it was not part of the question, but the private sector, the civil society are part of the process while developing the strategies, while developing the policies at the national level. And in terms of the implementation, each and every sector, every quarter holds what we call the joint sector review meeting. And this joint sector review meeting actually looks at the progress of what has been done in terms of the climate change as cross-cutting, in terms of gender as cross-cutting. And the civil society organizations are also invited to present on the same, especially based on the resources that we have received across from different development partners to be able to get the complete data from the national perspective. On the fossil fuel, I think this is something that everybody is trying to see how we can be able to reduce it. Of recently, Rwanda introduced the electric vehicles as part of the solution, but it's more a solution for that matter because it is just starting. And for the case of women, especially those ones that are majority of them actually that are involved in the cooking, it creates a lot of indoor pollution, and that is really very dangerous in terms of different impacts, including the diseases that these fossil fuels can create. So apparently, we are looking at one of our macro level indicator actually is to see how we can be able to reduce the fossil fuels as well as the biomass. So this is the target. And what we will be helping in is actually to see how we can incentivize some of the private investments that are coming in, creating some avenues for the clean energy and clean energy for cooking, for that matter. So basically, that is what I can say on the two questions that Paul Steele asked. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sabiti. I will just check with the other speakers. I do see Ms. Guzman has her hand up, so please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Anas, and thank you so much to Paul. And it was really great to collaborate with Paul in this case of Mexico. Well, first of all, I just wanted to, regarding why the budget in fossil fuels is bad for women and girls. I think when we talk about fossil fuels, we normally talk about the greenhouse gases emissions and the effect on climate change. And I think this has two different, it has a direct impact and indirect impact. So through the climate change, of course, we know that women are more vulnerable in many situations to climate change. But there is another component that we don't talk a lot, which is precisely the bad. So when we produce fossil fuels, gas, oil, coal, there is also a problem with air quality. And in many, many cities, we are suffering the bad air quality, which is affecting a lot kids, children, and obviously women and the elderly. And it has been proven that women are more affected because of different elements related to the bad air quality. So it's not only the effect of climate change that is causing all these droughts, all these floods, all these problems at the territorial level, but it's also this direct impact that the people is having because of the production and consumption of these fossil fuels. So when we see about the whole cycle of fossil fuel investments are producing effects and impacts across the population, but particularly in women and girls, because it's affecting them directly and in different ways. And I just want to highlight the role of the civil society, because I think in my experience, I have been working on climate change for 16 years. And what I observe is that if you don't have a strong civil society, it's very likely that the changes in the government will change the whole priority, and it's going to be very difficult to continue this type of policy. So civil society has been very important to continue that conversation across the different, to go beyond the governmental periods and try to be very consistent and try to move and to push these agendas. Doesn't matter if there is a change in the government or not. So I think it's very, very important to keep strengthening the participation of civil society in the decision-making processes, because like we say that we are the memory, the historical memory of these policies. When one government comes with completely different priorities, we have to be there to remind them what are the key elements that we should be promoting in the specific moment. So I think it's very important to continue this strengthening the civil society in all these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Guzman. And I agree with all the points that you have mentioned, in particular, the role of civil society. I'll just check, Mr. Hussein, if you wanted to add anything to what's already been said.
Thank you. Though the question is not related to my presentation, but I think fossil fuel is harmful not for women and girls, for whole the society as a whole, and for the human being also. And I am a part of the government. Our civil society is also pressuring us not to use fossil fuel and reducing it. So this is really the suggestions comes from the civil society, but the government and our society, we have to rely on our fossil fuel, because we cannot survive without petroleum. We cannot run our car without petroleum. Though we are switching for solar and other renewable energy, I think this is I think we have to switch over to the renewable energy, avoiding fossil fuels in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also for reminding us that it's not just women and that it affects everybody. We do have 2 hands up. Let's start with Barry Smith. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think from the presentations that we've seen, you know, there's good examples in policy and budgeting of gender considerations being integrated, as well as sort of interplay with climate. But I'm just wondering, so these are good examples, but what was the political triggers or the tipping points for ensuring that gender actually was mainstreamed and there was gender allocations and climate allocations? Just start thinking about the sort of politicized nature of planning, as well as sort of some of these issues. I'm just wondering what lessons could be taken to other countries where the process isn't as advanced as in Rwanda, Mexico, and Bangladesh.
Thank you so much, Barry. That is an excellent question, actually. I'll just take the second question before we allow our panelists to respond. Second question is from our Executive Secretary, Neil Cole. Neil.
Thank you, Shanaz. So, I mean, this question, I think, partly relates to the earlier question that Paul asked and a discussion that we've been having, Shanaz. So, you know, following the heads of states and government engagement at COP, there were several big announcements that were, or well, I suppose, announcements that were made about very big investments, and the South African president certainly also made one of those announcements related to the co-financing of South Africa's transition from fossil fuel, or at least from coal, to renewables, and I suppose climate-friendly energy sources. And you know, with a background in public finance and working across the African continent, and the experience that we've had with capital projects in particular, we know that they are fraught with problems related to, well, questions around sort of who pays, which is an important question in public finance. Is there a transfer of technology, or will it simply be a case of Western countries who are investing, coming, building, leaving, and not transferring the technology? And then there's obviously the issues around delays, capacity, etc., etc. And you know, South Africa's two big coal-fired power stations is certainly beset with all those problems, and may even, you know, if we do move to renewables, these coal-fired power stations may even be mothballed before they get an opportunity to fully deliver on you know, the optimal level of output, which maybe, you know, from a climate perspective is not too bad a point. But here's my question. I mean, considering all of that, I wonder if we shouldn't be looking a lot more at the low-hanging fruit. I mean, I just think that within our control and within capabilities and budgets, that there's a lot that can still be done. That I suppose one can define as that low-hanging fruit. And I would think that if we taking this gender climate responsive approach, that it's that low-hanging fruit that may even be able to engage women a lot more in our programs. Thank you, Shanaz.
Great, thank you so much, Neil. I will now hand over to our panelists to quickly respond. I'll give you each about a minute and a half. Let's start the reverse order this way. So if we could start with Ms. Guzman, that would be great.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to well, probably two quick comments. The first comment is that we have to remember that developing countries, a lot of developing countries are still rely a lot on fossil fuels and extractive activities to generate revenue. So for many of our countries, it's like a big dilemma to divest in these activities to invest in more sustainable activities. For instance, the case of Mexico, I have been analyzing public expenditure and revenues for a lot of time, and this is a major constraint. No, it's okay. If I reduce my investments in these, so I'm not going to have enough money to invest in any other agenda. So I think we have to think in the whole cycle. And in the past, precisely in the previous government, one incentive to talk about climate change and to start talking about these cross-cutting agendas was precisely to diversify the economy, because at that point, that government understood that rely on fossil fuels when we are not a major producer of oil anymore is going to be harmful for the economy in the whole cycle. So that was a major incentive. However, this new government has this idea that we need to regain power. We need to regain this control of fossil fuels, because it's going to bring more money. So I think it's a generational approach and perspective, and that's why I insist in the role of civil society, because these changes in the government can change everything. No, if you change priorities, you basically can change everything. And for instance, the gender agenda was also a major push from civil society. There were a lot of movements from feminist movements that were promoting all these changes, and that was the trigger was the pressure in obviously the international pressure as well, because for instance Mexico has been quite active in terms of climate change at the international level, and that was like a extra push to change and to transform certain policies at the national level. But I think and that's why, for instance, being here in these type of processes is very important, to keep putting this pressure from the top-down approach, but it's even more important to do that pressure from the bottom-up approach and bring all these different sectors together. But I definitely think that when we talk about budgeting, we have to think in how we are going to actually diversify our economies, what type of industries we will create to transform completely the approach that we are following at the moment, and to create new enterprises, to generate new type of jobs. Otherwise, if you go and talk about fossil fuels and gender in a state that is fully coal producer or oil producer, or for them is that doesn't make sense, because they need this money, and they need this money to feed all the families, including women and men. So it's very important to see the whole cycle, to think in how we're going to transform right from the beginning, and do it in a comprehensive and cross-cutting way. So I think this is the time to do these changes, gender and climate change at the same time, all across the planning and in the whole public finance system. So yeah, that's what I wanted to comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Guzman. Mr. Hussein, would you like to come in with your intervention? You have 1.5 minutes.
Thank you for giving the floor again. Actually, the experience I have shared with all of you regarding Bangladesh government of Bangladesh efforts in gender responsive budgeting and financing for climate change adaptation. We have our policy supports in these regards, and we have our own climate change trust fund, over the last 10 years, our gender budget is increasing over the last 10 years, and we are now tackling with the climate budgeting, and not only the central level, but we are advocating through this project we are running with the technical support from UNDP. We are advocating the government and to go for adaptive social protection. we are the project we are running is gender responsive coastal adaptation or coastal area. But you know, Bangladesh is situated just beside on the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. So our coastal area is affected by cyclones, and the sea level rising. We are affected, and salinity is one of the most problem in our coastal area. And in this, and pure drinking water is scarce here. So we are supporting through gender responsive adaptation process for livelihood support and for drinking water support through this project. And we are calling it adaptive social protection. And our suggestion and our next course of action is to go for to bridge the gap for investment in the social protection system of Bangladesh through this project. Thank you. I'll see you again. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Mr. Sabiti, I will give you the final word, and when you are there, we also have one question directly related to Rwanda. This is coming from Zolani Sandiso Zonyani from GIZ, and he wants to know how is Rwanda working towards improving budget transparency in light of the 2019 Open Budget Survey Index score of 39 out of 100 by the International Budget Partnership. So if you could quickly, in 1 minute, maybe just respond to the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I think maybe let me begin with the climate and budgeting that we have been talking about. I think, as I have already mentioned in my presentation, Rwanda is making some good progress in terms of putting policies and strategies across and trying to link these policies and strategies down to the implementation and looking at how different investments, either from the national budget and even from the external support, can actually include the elements to do with two major cross-cuttings, the environment and climate change and the gender. And for the case of Rwanda, I think we don't do this because it is something that we are being requested to internationally, but based on the nature of our country, based on its size, based on the landscape, based on the majority of the inhabitants, then I think it is a condition to really look at how we can be able to combat the effects of climate change in two different economic sectors, including agriculture, including infrastructure, and see how we can be able to bring on board the roles and responsibilities of women, men, girls, and boys equally to the development of the country. On the question that Zoran asked, I don't know exactly the 2019 Open Survey that he's talking about. I don't know the methodology that was used. So I cannot be in position as well to say something on this. Otherwise, I know on the budget transparency, we are actually doing very well on this. But because I haven't seen this report and the methodology and how it was conducted, then I am not in a position to report to. Otherwise, thank you very much. The progress on the theme that we have been discussing is going on. And I think it is something that is very interesting that every country needs to push to make sure that we coherently, socially, economically develop our economies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sabiti. We do have one more question, and unfortunately we won't have time to answer it, but I will allow Tracy Kajumba from IIED to share it with us.
Thank you very much, Shanaz, and the presenters. Even if the time is not there, maybe food for thought. I've been working on gender climate for years now, but there are two issues. One of them is the capabilities across two areas where you have Ministry of Gender and climate handled in different areas. And then you have climate people not thinking gender and gender people not thinking climate. So I was interested in knowing how you tackle issues of capabilities across the two areas to bring them together. And from the male side of things, we've seen tick box exercises of having women there or men there, but transformative approaches of real impact reaching excluded groups like women and others is something that everybody is grappling with. I would also have loved to hear what has been transformative for you in addressing gender and climate together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I think that's an excellent way to actually end the session because, you know, you really have given us something to think about. So with that said, I just want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers for sharing the experience today with inclusive budgeting for climate change. And I also have the great pleasure to introduce Daisy Mukarakate. She's the Regional Climate Policy Advisor at UNDP, who will give us the closing remarks. Daisy, we do apologize for eating into part of your time, but you have the floor now.
No problem, Shanaz, and thank you. Thank you to all the presenters, and again, thank you for the questions. I think we got very good questions from the floor. My key takeaways, first of all, number one, I think we need to have very clear objectives. Why we are adopting gender responsive climate budgeting. Barry asked a very excellent question, like what triggered this to the panelists? And I found it quite interesting because if we don't have those clear objectives, then it's going to be very difficult for us to monitor, track and monitor progress. So that's one. Then two, we need, Neil mentioned it and several other speakers, an enabling policy environment. So we are talking of the policies, we are talking of the laws, we are talking of the institutions, and it has to be like a culture, like what Wanda was saying, like a whole of government approach, a whole of society approach. It's not supposed to be a project-based thing or a piecemeal thing. Then if we adopt that approach, then we are sure to achieve that. So we are talking of that has to be in our national development strategies, in our macroeconomic policy frameworks, we heard from Bangladesh, in our social protection policies, and down to sectoral policies. So you see how broad it can be. And again, it has to look at the global aspects. We have the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan. How is that feeding into that? Again, Bangladesh talked about their NDCs. By the way, UNDP supported 120 countries globally to revise NDCs. And we made sure that this time we budgeted for gender to make sure that gender is integrated into NDCs. So there's the global aspect, there's the regional, and then the national. Then we look at the timeline. We see that gender responsive budgeting started long back. Look at Bangladesh, 2009. And then climate responsive budgeting, only 2017 and 18. The same with Rwanda, for example. So when we are embarking on this, we should see it as a long-term process. Then I liked Tracy's intervention, the siloed approach. I mean, we are looking at gender responsive budgeting separately from climate response. How do we bring these two together? And I really like Bangladesh, the indicators that they have, like gender relevant allocation in climate budget allocation. Once you start having those kind of indicators, then you've hit the right button. It means double mainstreaming has been achieved. And Bangladesh was even talking of, at local level, gender tagging of local climate budget. I really, really like those indicators, because for most of us, we haven't gotten there. Then we talked about continual improvement. Mexico talked about the methodologies for allocation, how we should continually improve those. And even Rwanda said it's an iterative process. I mean, the tools that they were talking about, the PBCCs, the gender statements, it's an iterative process. So that is a key takeaway. We need continual improvement. We are seeing a positive trend in spending, both for gender and for climate. But like Mexico said, it's not stable. And I've seen this with many countries, and it really depends on the context. And for Mexico, we see that the austerity measures affected the prioritization of planet outcomes. Normally, planet outcomes suffer if we have urgent and competing development priorities. Then the other point is on data and information. That's very important to track and monitor progress and report on it. And all speakers mentioned this, and the challenge, of course, of having sex disaggregated data cannot be overemphasized. Then, of course, what I would call means of implementation, the resources, the tools, we've talked about it. Then the capacity building aspect, again, Tracy mentioned a very important point. When do we get to a point where we have one individual with both capacities? Now we don't have them, sorry to say. You will never get one individual who is knowledgeable about both gender and climate. Until we get there, then we will say we can effectively double mainstream. So we still have a long way. And Neil was talking about a cadre of experts. Let's have a cadre of experts that have both capacities in one person. And it's doable, I think. And my last point is, of course, we need gender responsive climate budgeting so that we achieve simultaneously both planet and people budget, outcomes of the SDGs. But of course, we have to take cognizance of the prosperity aspects. I think we talked about the jobs and income. We should keep an eye on the jobs and income aspects. Of course, the partnerships are important. And peace, why are we embarking on gender responsive climate budgeting? Well, to address inequality. You know the problems that we have with unequal societies. They are not peaceful societies. Crime, violent extremism in Africa, if you look at all that, it's due to unequal societies. So I have summarized all the 5 Ps of SDGs and how our session is important to achieving these 5 Ps. So thank you so much, colleagues, for the insightful presentation. And back to Shanaz, thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy, for winding up and for those very important insights. So with that, we just want to thank everyone for joining and end the session. So thank you all for being a part of this important session.
Thank you. Great session.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.